The scent of bleach was the first thing she knew every morning, and the last thing she smelled before sleep. Lyra's knuckles were raw, and a dull ache had settled deep in her lower back, a constant companion in her life of endless chores. She scrubbed the stone floor of the Silver Moon Pack's Great Hall, keeping her head down, her world reduced to a circle of wet, gray stone. In fact, her whole life felt like a circle of wet, gray stone. It was easier that way, because if she looked up, she might see them, and she didn't want them to see her. Not yet. Laughter and loud boasts echoed from the training yard just outside, the sounds of the pack's warriors, sounds of strength, sounds of life. Her heart gave a painful little flutter, a traitorous bird beating against the cage of her ribs. His laugh was in there somewhere, deeper and richer than the others. Kyle, the pack's beta, her fated mate. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the image of him from flooding her mind, the way his dark hair fell over his brow when he was focused, the powerful set of his shoulders, the easy confidence in his stride. He was everything she wasn't, strong, seen, respected, and she was the Omega orphan, the girl who cleaned up the messes no one else would. Maybe it was fate that made them so different, a cruel cosmic joke. With every heartbeat, she felt the invisible string of the mate bond humming between them, a connection only she seemed to notice. To him, she was just another shadow polishing the floors. But then a flicker of hope, warm and dangerous, bloomed in her chest. What if he didn't know? How could he? She'd never had the courage to tell him. The thought was terrifying, a leap from the highest cliff into an unknown sea. But the alternative, a lifetime of this aching loneliness, was so much worse. Before she could move, 2 warriors strode past, their muddy boots smearing her clean floor. They didn't even glance down. It was as if she wasn't there at all, just a part of the castle's fixtures. A cold weight settled in her chest, the familiar feeling of being utterly invisible. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was her existence, day in and day out. She could either accept this life of being unseen, unheard, and untouched, or she could take the biggest risk of her life. She finished her work, her movements stiff, her mind a whirlwind. That night, she stood before the small, cracked mirror in her tiny room, looking at the reflection of a girl with wide, fearful eyes and a spirit that felt worn thin. But tonight, something else was there too, a flicker of resolve. She had to know, one way or another. Tomorrow. She would tell him tomorrow. That single decision was a tiny spark in the vast darkness of her world. Come morning, the pack house buzzed with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with her. Lyra moved through the kitchens, her hands busy preparing the morning meal, but her mind was a million miles away, rehearsing the words she would say to Kale. Her stomach twisted into knots, a nest of writhing serpents. As she carried a tray of fresh bread into the dining hall, their voices hit her first, sharp, glittering, and cruel. A trio of high-ranking she-wolves, their fur glossy and their postures radiating arrogance, were gathered by the hearth, and they were talking about him. Kale has been training harder than ever, said a tall she-wolf named Lyra. The alpha of the Crimson Fang Pack is looking for a strong alliance. His daughter is unmated, you know. Another one, Vexia, laughed, a sound like shattering glass. An alliance with the Crimson Fangs would make us the most powerful pack in the region. Kale needs a mate with strength and status, someone who can solidify his position. The third wolf preened. Can you imagine if he ended up with some low-born nobody? A weak mate would be an anchor, dragging him down. It would be a disgrace. Lyra froze just inside the doorway, the heavy tray suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her breath caught in her throat. Their words weren't just idle gossip. They were a direct assault on the fragile hope she had so carefully built. To make things worse, they were painting a picture of a world where fate didn't matter. Only power. The fates are kind, but they aren't stupid, Vexia added with a smirk. They wouldn't pair a lion with a mouse. The sound of their laughter followed, sharp and mocking. It wasn't directed at her, Not really. They didn't even know she was there. But it pierced her all the same. A poison dart straight to her heart. The world she had imagined. A world where a fated bond was enough. Where love could bridge any gap, crumbled into dust. She didn't know what scared her more. The thought of Cale rejecting her, or the thought that these she-wolves were right. Without thinking, she backed away, slipping into the shadows of the corridor before they could see her. The warm bread in her hands had grown cold. Her resolve, once a tiny, steady flame, now flickered wildly in a storm of doubt and fear. Her initial plan to simply tell him felt naive, childish even. Now she felt a desperate, burning need to prove them wrong. She had to show them, and him, that she wasn't just a mouse. She had to be so much more than what they saw. This was no longer just about hope. It was about survival.
Silence. That was the first thing King Rowan noticed every single day. The silence in his throne room was immense, a living entity that pressed in from all sides. It was the silence of power, the silence of solitude, the silence of a man who stood so far above others that their voices could no longer reach him. The throne itself was cold, carved from the heart of a mountain, and it felt less like a seat of power and more like a cage of ice. He sat there, the weight of his crown a familiar pressure on his brow, listening to the reports from his spymaster. His kingdom was vast, his rule absolute, but a sickness was festering on the edges of his domain. "The rogue attacks are becoming more organized, Your Majesty," the spymaster said, his voice a low murmur in the cavernous hall. "They're testing our borders, growing bolder. The latest reports from the Silver Moon Pack are concerning. Their beta is strong, but their alpha grows complacent. The pack shows signs of internal weakness." Rowan's jaw tightened. Weakness was a disease. It spread. And what does their alpha do? "He assures us he has it under control." Rowan's golden eyes, the color of a wolf's in the moonlight, narrowed. An assurance from a weak alpha was worth less than the breath used to speak it. He dismissed the spymaster with a flick of his wrist, and the man bowed and retreated, his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. Left alone, Rowan stood and walked to the great window overlooking the capital, his city, his people, his responsibility. He had fought wars, negotiated treaties, and built a legacy of strength that would be remembered for 1,000 years. Not only that, he had done it all alone. Truth be told, a part of him had always felt a strange emptiness, a void where something important was supposed to be. The elders spoke of the King's Mark, a legendary bond that would ignite when an Alpha King finally met his true mate, his queen. It was a pretty story, a fairy tale told to lonely kings to give them hope. He had stopped believing in it a long time ago. Love was a luxury, and destiny was a fickle beast. His only mate was his duty. But then a strange restlessness stirred within him, a primal dissatisfaction he couldn't name. The thought of the Silver Moon Pack, of a pack rotting from the inside out. It grated on his very soul. It was a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of his kingdom, and he felt a sudden, undeniable urge to pull it. Why did this one pack's weakness bother him so much? Was it merely the threat to his borders? Or was it something else? A whisper on the wind he couldn't quite hear. He turned back to the empty throne room, the silence roaring in his ears. An idea, sharp and decisive, cut through the fog of his thoughts. This was a matter that required more than a messenger. It required a message. It required the presence of the king. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. His voice when he spoke to the empty air was not loud, but it carried the unshakable force of command, a sound meant to move armies. He strode to the doors and pulled them open, his voice echoing down the long hall to the guards who stood waiting. "Prepare the royal guard. We ride for Silver Moon at dawn."
There he was. Cale stood in the middle of the training yard, his back slick with sweat, laughing with a group of his warrior friends. Sunlight caught in his dark hair, and he looked every bit the powerful beta he was born to be. For a moment, Lyra's courage failed her, a frightened bird fluttering in her throat. The she-wolf's cruel words from this morning echoed in her ears, a chorus of doubt and scorn. But then, she remembered the aching loneliness of her small room, the sting of being invisible. That pain was worse than any fear. Her body moved on instinct, carrying her out of the shadows and into the bright, open yard. The warrior's laughter died as she approached, their eyes landing on her with a mixture of confusion and dismissal. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but she only saw him. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the whole world could hear it. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of her life about to change. She stopped a few feet from him, her hands twisting in the worn fabric of her tunic. "Kyle?" Her voice was a bare whisper, small and thin. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing more strength into it. "Beta Kale, can I speak with you?" He raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips as he glanced at his friends. "The little Omega wants to talk." "What is it?" Her cheeks burned with shame, but she pushed on. "This was it. It's about us," she stammered, the words feeling clumsy and foolish on her tongue. "There's a bond. The fates. They chose us. You and me. We're mates." As the silence stretched, it became a physical thing, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Kale's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of blank disbelief. His eyes scanned her, from her worn-out shoes to her plain, unremarkable face. It was a look that stripped her bare, weighed her, and found her wanting. And then... He laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a loud, cruel, echoing sound that ripped through the silence and tore her world apart. He threw his head back and roared, his friends joining in, their collective laughter a tidal wave of humiliation that crashed over her. "You?" Kale finally gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You are my mate? An Omega?" He spat the word out like it was poison. "The fates must be drunk. I reject you. I, Kyle, Beta of the Silver Moon Pack, reject you." The air left her lungs in a silent whoosh, as if he'd landed a physical blow. The world narrowed to a dizzying pinprick of light. The sounds of their laughter faded into a dull roar in her ears. His words, his laughter, they weren't just a rejection. They were an execution. Her world shattered. Before she could move, before she could think, her legs were already turning. Without warning, she was running, fleeing the training yard as if the hounds of hell were at her heels. Their howling laughter followed her, chasing her, branding her with a shame so deep she thought it might actually kill her. She didn't stop until the deep, dark woods swallowed her whole and she finally collapsed at the base of an ancient oak, the sound of her own broken sobs the only thing left in the world. Time stood still, or maybe it rushed past in a blur. Lyra didn't know. She was curled into a tight ball, her body shaking with grief, the forest floor damp and cold beneath her. The sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of blood and bruises, but she didn't see it. All she saw was the look on Kale's face. All she heard was the echo of that terrible laugh. As darkness seeped into the woods, a new kind of cold began to creep over her skin. A primal fear. The forest, once her only sanctuary, now felt menacing. The shadows danced between the trees, taking on sinister shapes. Her wolf, a creature so timid it rarely ever stirred, was now pacing frantically beneath her skin, whining in terror. Danger. Suddenly, a twig snapped nearby. Lyra's head shot up, her sobs catching in her throat. Her heart skipped. She wasn't alone. She strained her ears, listening past the frantic drumming of her own pulse. A low, guttural snarl cut through the night. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Rogues. She could smell them now, the rank scent of blood, matted fur, and a desperate, lawless hunger. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough bark of the oak tree, trying to make herself smaller, trying to become invisible again. But it was too late. Gleaming eyes materialized in the dark. One pair, then two. then 4. They were surrounding her. A large, scarred wolf with mangy fur and crazed yellow eyes stepped forward, its lips peeling back to reveal rows of stained, wicked teeth. It saw her for what she was: weak, alone, prey. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was it. This was how her story ended. Rejected and alone, torn apart in the dark. The lead rogue lunged, a blur of mangy fur and snapping jaws. Her voice was gone, a scream trapped in her throat. She threw her arms up to shield her face, bracing for the searing pain of teeth tearing into her flesh. But it never came. Instead, there was a sound like thunder, a blur of black motion, and a sickening crunch. The rogue that had been about to kill her was thrown sideways, its body hitting a tree with a final broken whimper. Lyra lowered her arms, her eyes wide with shock. A massive black wolf now stood over her, its body a wall of solid muscle between her and the other rogues. Its fur was the color of a starless night sky, and silver-tipped hairs gleamed like frost under the faint moonlight. It turned its head slightly, and its eyes locked on hers. They were gold. Not the yellow of a normal wolf, but a deep, molten gold that burned with a fierce, terrifying intelligence. In that moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. It was as if fate demanded it. This was no ordinary wolf. This was something more. Before either could speak or even breathe, the other rogues, emboldened by their numbers, charged. Her protector didn't hesitate. It met them with a roar that was less an animal sound and more a declaration of absolute power, a promise of death.
Rowan moved like a phantom of death through the chaos. The rogue attack was pathetic, disorganized, a testament to the Silver Moon Pack's weakness. His royal guard was more than handling it, but he fought alongside them, his claws and teeth a blur of silver and blood. Battle was a cold, clean thing. There was no thought, only instinct. No emotion, only the grim satisfaction of restoring order. He was a king. This was his duty. He ripped the throat out of one rogue and was turning to the next. And then he saw her. As if pulled by a string, his eyes were drawn to a small clearing near the edge of the woods. A tiny Omega she-wolf, cornered against a tree, her face stained with tears, terror etched into every line of her body. She was nothing, a nobody, another victim in a pointless skirmish. So why couldn't he look away? The moment their eyes locked, the world tilted on its axis. The sounds of the battle, the screams, the snarls, they all faded into a distant hum. A bolt of lightning shot down his spine, hot and fierce, and a fire erupted on his skin, an ancient power awakening from a 1,000-year slumber. The king's mark, the myth, the fairy tale. It was real. A single word burned into his mind, branded onto his very soul. Mine. Without thinking, his body moved, no longer a king leading a battle, but a male claiming his mate. He crossed the distance between them in a series of powerful, ground-eating strides, his world narrowing until she was the only thing in it. He reached her just as the last of the rogues lunged. He didn't just kill it, he annihilated it, his rage a cold, precise storm. He turned back to her, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in harsh pants. She was staring up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She was so small, so fragile, and she was his. The magic of the mark surged through him, demanding a physical claim. It was not a choice. It was a compulsion as undeniable as the rising of the sun. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently tilted her chin up. As his thumb brushed against the soft skin of her throat, the mark flared to life. A glowing, intricate silver crest materialized on her skin, a swirling pattern of a wolf in a crown, pulsing with a soft, ethereal light. It was a brand, a claim, a declaration to the entire world. A stunned gasp came from behind him. Rowan turned, his golden eyes blazing, his arm instinctively moving to shield Lyra. Kyle, the pack's beta, stood there, his face a mask of utter shock and horrified disbelief, his eyes fixed on the glowing mark on Lyra's throat. Rowan didn't care about the beta. He didn't care about the pack or the war. In that moment, he only cared about the trembling woman behind him. Before the words left his lips, a low, possessive growl ripped from his chest, a sound that promised a world of pain to anyone who dared to even think of harming her. It was a sound that echoed through the sudden, dead silence of the forest, the sound of a king who had just found his queen.
When she woke, it wasn't the smell of bleach that greeted her, but the rich, clean scent of cedar and old leather. And it was the softness that truly terrified her. Lyra was lying on a mountain of furs so plush she felt like she was sinking into a cloud. A fire crackled softly in a nearby brazier, casting dancing shadows across the walls of a massive tent. It was a king's tent, filled with dark wood furniture and chests bound in iron. Her old, threadbare tunic was gone, and in its place was a simple but exquisitely soft linen shift. Her whole world had been turned upside down, but her body only registered one thing: the strange, tingling heat on her throat. As if pulled by a string, her gaze found a shimmering silver mirror propped against a chest. She pushed herself up, the furs falling away, and stumbled toward it. Her legs felt weak, unsteady. And then she saw it. There, on her skin, was the king's mark. It wasn't a crude brand, but an intricate, swirling crest of a wolf's head inside a crown, glowing with a soft, silver light. It was beautiful. And it was a cage, a brand, an irrefutable claim. She felt like a trapped animal, a prize won in a battle she never wanted to be a part of because the luxury was more suffocating than any poverty she had ever known. Her breath hitched, her heart hammered against her ribs. Who was he? Why had he done this? As if summoned by her fear, the tent flap opened, and he entered. The king. He filled the space, his presence so immense it seemed to suck all the air from the tent. He was even bigger than he'd seemed in the forest, a mountain of quiet, controlled power. He had changed into a simple leather tunic, but it did nothing to hide the raw strength in his shoulders and chest. His golden eyes, the color of ancient, molten treasure, found hers. "You are safe here," he said. His voice was a low, rumbling sound, like rocks shifting deep underground. It wasn't intentionally menacing, but it was the voice of a man used to absolute obedience. Safe? She had never felt less safe in her entire life. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to become the invisible girl again. She took a step back, her bare feet cold on the thick rug. He took a step forward. "I am Rowan. You do not need to be afraid." But she was afraid, because Kale had been powerful too, and his power had been a weapon he used to crush her. Before she could stop it, her body moved on instinct. As he raised a hand, not to strike, but perhaps to comfort, she flinched violently, squeezing her eyes shut and bracing for a blow that never came. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with his confusion, and her shame.
Back in his own tent, the silence was a roaring accusation. Rowan stared into the flames of his own fire, but all he could see was the stark, undiluted terror in her eyes. She had looked at him as if he were a monster. He, who had just saved her life. He, who was her fated mate, a bond that was supposed to be the most sacred thing in their world. He was a king, a warrior, a commander of armies. Yet a single flinch from a tiny Omega she-wolf had left him feeling utterly powerless. He was baffled because he had done everything right by their laws, by their instincts, and yet it had all gone so terribly wrong. He needed to understand. "Valerius," he barked. Moments later, the tent flap opened, and his most trusted captain entered, a grizzled old wolf with a scarred face and eyes that had seen 100 battles. Valerius bowed his head. "Your Majesty." "The Omega," Rowan said, his voice tight. "Her name is Lyra. Find out everything. I want to know why she was alone in those woods." I want to know why she looks at me like I am her executioner." Valerius nodded once and disappeared. He was back in less than an hour, his face grim. He stood before the king and spoke, his words blunt and stripped of any softness. "Her parents died in the last rogue war. She has no other family. This morning she approached the pack Beta, a wolf named Kale." Rowan's eyes narrowed. "Go on." "She confessed the mate bond to him, in front of the entire training yard." A cold knot formed in Rowan's stomach. "And the Beta, your majesty?" Valerius paused, his jaw working. He laughed. He called her worthless. And then he publicly rejected her. The entire pack joined in the laughter. She fled into the woods to hide. That's where the rogues found her. A fury so cold, so absolute, it threatened to shatter his kingly control washed over Rowan. The air in the tent grew heavy, charged with his silent, murderous rage. He laughed, in front of the pack. He had taken her heart, the most fragile and hopeful part of her, and he had crushed it for sport. In that moment, Rowan understood. Lyra wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of his power. She was afraid because the last powerful male she had trusted with her soul had used that power to humiliate and destroy her. And Rowan, with his crown and his army and his overwhelming aura of command, was the most powerful male she had ever met. To her, he must seem like the ultimate threat. He was furious because Kale had dared to harm what was his, what was precious. But even worse, he now knew that his greatest asset, his strength, was the very thing that stood between him and his mate. He couldn't command her to trust him. He couldn't force her to heal. What followed was a decision made not from strategy but from a raw, protective instinct he was only just beginning to understand. He couldn't fix her wounds here, not in the place that had caused them. He would take her home, to the capital, to his fortress. There he could shield her from the world while he figured out how to tear down the walls around her heart.
The journey to the capital was a blur of motion and fear. Lyra rode in a closed carriage, the silken cushions feeling alien and wrong. She felt like a stolen object, a spoil of war being transported to the victor's castle. And what a castle it was! It wasn't just a castle, it was a mountain carved into a fortress with towering spires that seemed to scrape the clouds and walls so high they made her feel like an ant. Inside, her life became a dizzying whirlwind of servants dressing her in gowns of impossible softness, of hallways so long their ends were lost in shadow, of the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. She felt like an imposter, a brown field mouse dressed in the glittering feathers of a songbird, because deep down, she still felt like the worthless Omega from the Silver Moon Pack. Days later, Rowan decided she was to be presented to the court. She stood beside his throne in the Great Hall, a cavernous chamber filled with hundreds of the most powerful wolves in the kingdom. The weight of their stares was a physical pressure, and she could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their contempt. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive perfume, felt hard to breathe. As Rowan spoke, his voice echoing with command, a she-wolf glided toward them. She was impossibly beautiful, draped in deep blue velvet, with eyes the color of ice and a smile that never reached them. "Your Majesty," she purred, bowing her head slightly to Rowan before turning her cold eyes on Lyra. "We are all so surprised by your choice. A new queen is a momentous occasion." Lyra could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The she-wolf's smile widened, but it was sharp, like the edge of a knife. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "An Omega Queen," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "How quaint. I trust you won't be too overwhelmed by your duties." The words, though wrapped in silk, were a slap in the face. They hit her with the same force as Kale's laughter. The world threatened to gray out at the edges, just like it had in the yard. Her carefully constructed composure crumbled, and the old, familiar shame flooded her veins, cold and paralyzing. She froze, unable to speak, unable to breathe. She was about to break, but then, Something warm and solid settled on the small of her back. Rowan. He hadn't said a word, but he had moved to stand just a little closer, his hand a steady, grounding presence. He didn't look at Lyra. Instead, his molten gold eyes settled on the beautiful she-wolf. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was so cold, so filled with absolute authority and a promise of silent, devastating consequences, that the she-wolf's smile faltered. The color drained from her face, and with a stammered apology, she practically fled, melting back into the crowd. In the quiet that followed, Rowan's hand remained on her back, a silent, unshakable shield. It didn't fix the wound the she-wolf's words had opened, but for the first time since she'd woken up in his tent, she felt something other than fear. A tiny, fragile flicker of something else. He was her captor, her king, the source of her terror. But he was also her protector. And she didn't know what scared her more. The fragile peace he was trying to build around Lyra felt like a house of glass, and Cale was outside, picking up stones. Rowan stood before a massive map of the territories, his spymaster's words echoing in the tense silence of the war room. It was worse than he thought. Much worse. "He's not just whining about a lost mate, Your Majesty," Valerius reported, his voice grim. "He's twisting the story. To make things worse, he's painting you as a tyrant king who stole a destined beta's mate out of lust. He claims the king's mark was a trick, a spell you cast to justify taking her." Rowan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. The sheer arrogance of the lie was breathtaking. But he knew it was a smart lie, a dangerous one. Because it preyed on the fears of the smaller packs, their resentment of a king so powerful he could seemingly bend destiny to his will. "And that's not all," Valerius continued, his gaze dark. "He's using Lyra's rank against her. He's spreading whispers that you have shamed the throne by choosing an Omega, that an Omega cannot be a queen, that her weakness will be the downfall of us all." A low growl rumbled in Rowan's chest, a sound of pure, volcanic fury. Every word was a calculated insult, an attack aimed not just at him, but directly at Lyra. Cale was methodically rebuilding the very cage of worthlessness she was just beginning to escape. He wasn't just trying to undermine a king, he was trying to break a queen. "The Silver Moon Pack is divided," Valerius finished. "Some are loyal to you, but many are listening to Cale. His words are poison, and they are spreading." Rowan turned from the map, his golden eyes burning with a cold fire. His first instinct was to ride out, to drag Cale back in chains and make a public example of him. But he couldn't. Not only that, he knew that using brute force would only prove Cale's point. It would make him look like the very tyrant Cale claimed he was. No, this wasn't a battle to be won with claws and teeth. This was a war for the hearts of his people. And to win it, they needed to see Lyra not as a stolen Omega, but as the queen she was destined to be. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. He had to stop shielding her from the world and start showing her the truth of her own power. That night, Rowan came to her chambers. There was a new urgency in his eyes, a seriousness that made her pulse race with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He didn't speak of courts or politics. Instead, he simply held out his hand. "There is something I must show you," he said, his voice low and serious. Her heart skipped. Without thinking, she placed her hand in his. His was warm and strong, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers, sending a jolt of surprising heat through her. He led her not to the grand halls, but down a winding stone staircase she had never seen before, deep into the foundations of the castle. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth, ancient stone, and something else. Something wild and magical. They emerged into a breathtaking cavern. A hidden grove, nestled in the heart of the mountain. A canopy of glowing moss coated the ceiling, casting a soft blue-green light over everything. In the center of the cavern, a spring bubbled up from the ground, its water so clear it looked like liquid moonlight. This place felt alive. It hummed with a quiet, ancient power. "This is the Heartwood," Rowan said, his voice reverent. "The source of the kingdom's magic. It is said that the first Alpha King planted a seed here, and from it, this fortress grew." Lyra stared, mesmerized. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. "I brought you here to show you the truth of the mark," he continued, turning to face her. The glow from the Heartwood spring illuminated his face, softening the harsh lines of his kingly authority, revealing the man beneath. "It is not a brand of ownership, Lyra. It is a bridge, a bond of shared strength, of a shared soul." Before she could speak, he gently reached out and placed his palm over the king's mark on her throat. As if fate demanded it, the moment his skin touched hers, the Heartwood spring erupted in a silent pulse of brilliant light. A surge of raw power, warm and overwhelming, shot through her. The world dissolved. She was no longer in the cavern. She was standing in a vast, empty throne room, the silence a crushing weight. She felt a loneliness so profound, so absolute, it was a physical ache in her chest. Decades of solitude, of duty without companionship, of being a king but never a man. It washed over her, a tidal wave of his pain. His loneliness. At the same time, the vision shifted. Suddenly, she was in a training yard, the sun beating down, the air filled with cruel, echoing laughter. She felt the shame, the soul-shattering agony of rejection so vividly it was like it was happening all over again. But this time, it wasn't her pain she was feeling. It was his. He was feeling what she had felt. Between one breath and the next, the vision shattered, leaving them both gasping in the soft glow of the Heartwood. They stumbled back from each other, their chests heaving. Her world tilted. The space between them burned with a new, terrifying, and beautiful understanding. He wasn't just a king who had claimed her. He was a soul who had felt her deepest wound as his own. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of something else. She looked at him, truly seeing the man behind the crown for the very first time. Her voice trembled. "You were alone too."
Her words hung in the air, a fragile bridge built between them in the aftermath of the magic. You were alone too. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. A statement of shared experience that cracked the armor he had worn around his heart for a century. The connection had changed everything. When they returned to the upper levels of the castle, the air between them was different. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, wondering empathy, and the frustration in his heart had been replaced by a fierce, bone-deep need to protect not just her body, but the fragile, healing pieces of her soul. But their newfound peace was a delicate, sun-warmed flower, and a serpent was already slithering through the grass. He was in his study late the next night when Valerius entered, his face carved from stone. He didn't speak. He simply placed a small, folded piece of parchment on Rowan's desk. It was sealed with the sigil of a lesser house, a pathetic attempt at disguise. It was being smuggled to the Queen's chambers, Valerius said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Rowan's blood ran cold. He picked it up, the paper feeling unnaturally slick beneath his fingers. He broke the seal. The handwriting was Kale's, and the words were pure venom. My dearest Lyra, I see the king dresses you in fine silks, but does he see the omega shivering beneath them? A gilded cage is still a cage. He parades you like a trophy, a symbol of his power, but a crown can't change what you are. Deep down, you know the truth. You don't belong there. Don't you miss home? Don't you miss the sky that doesn't judge you? Come back, little mouse. Come back before he tires of his new toy and discards you. I was a fool. I see that now. Let me fix my mistake. Yours, Kyle. A growl rose in his throat, a sound that was not human. His vision tunneled, a red haze of pure murderous rage descending over him. He wanted to hunt Cale down and tear the lying, manipulative words from his throat. He wanted to burn the note, to pretend it never existed, to shield Lyra from its poison. But then, the memory of the heartwood flooded back. The feel of her pain, sharp and real. To hide this from her now would be a betrayal of the trust they had just built. It would be treating her like the fragile, broken thing Cale accused her of being. It would make him no better than a jailer. He had to trust her. He had to believe that the woman who had faced his loneliness without flinching was strong enough to face the ghost of her past. The tension broke. His decision was made. He stood, the poisoned parchment clutched in his fist. With every step he took toward her chambers, his heart hammered against his ribs. This was a greater test than any battle. He was about to hand his queen the very weapon designed to destroy her, and he could only pray that the bond between them was strong enough to withstand the venom.
Sleep had not come easily. The memory of the heartwood, the feeling of Rowan's loneliness, the echo of her own pain inside his soul, played over and over in her mind. It had changed everything. The fear she'd felt for him had been replaced by something far more complex, something fragile and terrifyingly real. She was pacing the plush rug in her chambers when a soft scratching sound came from her balcony door. Her heart leaped into her throat. It wasn't the sound of a guard. It was stealthy, secret. Before she could call for help, a small, dark shape scurried across the stone and deposited a sealed parchment at her feet before disappearing back into the night. A trained raven. Her blood ran cold. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, who it was from. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Kyle's scent clung to the paper, a ghost from a life that felt 1,000 years away. Her first instinct was to burn it, to pretend it never existed. The old Lyra, the girl who ran from pain, screamed at her to hide. But then, she remembered Rowan's eyes in the glowing cavern. She remembered the shared vulnerability, the unspoken promise. Hiding this would be a betrayal of that fragile trust. It would mean that Cale's poisoned words still had power over her. It would mean that he was right, that she was still just a shivering omega beneath the silk. No. As the silence stretched, a new strength, hard and clear as diamond, formed in her chest. She would not let him break what she was building here. She would not let him turn her into a secret keeper. Without another word to herself, she strode from her room, the note clutched in her hand like a weapon. She found Rowan in the corridor, walking toward her chambers, his face a mask of grim determination. He was holding an identical piece of parchment. He stopped when he saw her, his golden eyes widening in surprise as he looked from the note in his hand to the one in hers. Before he could speak, she held it out to him. Her hand was shaking, but her voice was steady. "He sent too," she said simply. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. This was her choice, her commitment. "He thinks I am still the girl who ran crying into the woods." She took a deep breath, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. He is wrong. In that moment, she wasn't just an omega claimed by a king. She was a woman choosing her own destiny, and she was choosing him. She had crossed a line in her own heart, and there was no turning back.
Rowan stared at the parchment in her hand, then back at her face. He saw the tremor in her fingers, but he also saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. She hadn't hidden it. She hadn't let the poison seep in. She had faced the serpent and brought it directly to him. A tidal wave of emotion crashed through him, a fierce, possessive pride so intense it almost brought him to his knees. This was not the frightened girl he had found in the woods. This was a queen. His queen. He gently took the note from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. He now held both of Cale's pathetic little daggers. Instead of destroying Lyra, they had only served to arm her with a strength she didn't know she possessed. And Cale, in his arrogance, had just handed Rowan the one thing he needed most: justification. "He will never touch you again," Rowan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The words were not just a promise. They were a vow sealed in the cold fire of his rage. He turned, his mind clear, and his purpose absolute. The time for quiet protection was over. The time for reacting to Kyle's pathetic games was over. It was time to remind the world what it meant to challenge a king. What followed was not an act of passion, but one of pure, calculated power. He strode into the great hall where the court was still gathered for the evening meal, Lyra at his side. His sudden entrance brought an immediate hushed silence. He didn't take his throne. Instead, he stood in the center of the hall, a commanding presence that drew every eye. "There have been whispers," Rowan began, his voice echoing off the high stone ceilings, each word sharp and clear as ice. Whispers of dissent, fueled by the lies of a jealous and dishonorable wolf. He let his gaze sweep over the assembled nobles, daring any of them to look away. "Let me put these whispers to rest." He raised Lyra's hand, the one that had held the note, and intertwined his fingers with hers. Her hand was small in his, but it felt like the anchor of his entire world. "This is Lyra, of the House of Rowan, my fated mate, your future queen." His voice dropped, but it lost none of its power. If anything, it grew more intense. "Our final marking ceremony, a bond to be witnessed by the fates and by this entire kingdom, will be held on the next full moon." A collective gasp went through the hall. This was more than an announcement. It was a declaration of war. "Her word is my word," Rowan declared, his voice rising to a roar of absolute authority. "Her honor is my honor, and anyone who dares to question her position questions me. From this moment on, any word spoken against her will be considered treason." He let the threat hang in the air, a sword over all their heads. He had just drawn a line in the sand, and the entire world could see it. Cale wanted to play a game of whispers and shadows. Rowan had just turned on all the lights. As the news of the proclamation spread like wildfire, he knew it would reach Cale by morning. And he knew with chilling certainty that a wolf who could no longer win with words would be forced to turn to his claws.
In the weeks that followed, the castle buzzed with preparations for the ceremony. Lyra found herself swept up in a world of dress fittings and protocol lessons. Rowan, true to his word, began to gently acclimate her to her new role. He started taking her with him on short official visits into the city that sprawled below the castle, wanting the people to see her not as a myth, but as their queen. It was on one of these visits that their carefully constructed world came crashing down. They were walking through a bustling market square, the air filled with the scent of spices and baking bread. For the first time, Lyra felt a flicker of ease. The common people weren't like the nobles. They smiled at her with open curiosity, not veiled contempt. She was just starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. That's when she saw it. A flicker of unnatural movement in the crowd. A man, his face obscured by a low hood, pushing his way forward with a desperate, frantic energy. Her breath caught. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity. She saw the glint of metal in his hand, a wicked-looking dagger, its blade coated in something that shimmered with a sickly green light. Silver poison, meant for an alpha. Meant for Rowan? No. It was aimed at her. Before she could scream, before she could even process the thought, Rowan moved. He was a blur of motion, a force of nature. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He simply reacted, his body a living shield. He shoved her behind him with one powerful arm, spinning to face the threat. The assassin was fast, but Rowan was faster. He deflected the man's arm, but not entirely. The poisoned blade, meant for her heart, sliced a deep, vicious gash across Rowan's forearm. A roar of pure, primal fury ripped from Rowan's throat as his guards swarmed the assassin, tackling him to the cobblestones. The market erupted into chaos, screams and shouts echoing off the stone buildings. But Lyra didn't see any of it. Her world had narrowed to one horrifying image, the dark, sluggish blood welling from the wound on Rowan's arm. His blood, spilled for her. The terror she felt was instantly burned away, replaced by a hot, white-hot rage she had never felt before. This wasn't about whispers anymore. This wasn't about her past. This was about the man, the king, who had just thrown himself in front of a poisoned blade to save her life. Without thinking, she ripped a long strip from the silk hem of her own extravagant gown. She pushed through the ring of stunned guards and dropped to her knees beside Rowan, pressing the fabric tightly against the wound. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice not the whisper of an omega, but the sharp, clear command of a woman fighting for something she refused to lose. As he looked down at her, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of pain and shock, he wasn't looking at a frightened girl. He was looking at a queen, her face pale but her eyes blazing with the fierce protective fire of a wolf defending its mate. The attack had been meant to kill her, to shatter their future. Instead, it had forged her fear into a weapon.
Pain was an old acquaintance, but this was different. This was weakness. The silver poison didn't burn like a clean fire. It was a cold, creeping sludge in his veins, leaching the strength from his muscles, turning his bones to lead. His legendary alpha healing, which could normally knit flesh and mend bone in hours, was slowed to a frustrating crawl. He sat on the edge of his bed, the effort of merely sitting upright a monumental task, and listened as his kingdom began to burn. Valeria stood before him, his face a mask of grim duty, but Rowan could see the barely concealed panic in his old friend's eyes. "The assassin was a diversion, Your Majesty," Valeria said, his voice flat and heavy, as if the words themselves had weight. "A brilliant, brutal one." While our attention was on the market, Cale made his move. Rowan stared at his bandaged arm, the simple white linen a symbol of his failure. "The Silver Moon Pack?" "He's taken it," Valerius confirmed. "The old Alpha is dead." Cale challenged him, claiming the Alpha was too weak to protect the pack from a tyrannical king. He spat the words with disgust. "He slaughtered those loyal to you and named himself Alpha. The assassination attempt was his proof that you couldn't even protect your own mate in your own city." A growl, weak but full of venom, rattled in Rowan's chest. He had seen Cale as a jealous ex-mate, a political nuisance. He had not seen him as a king-killer, a warlord. He had underestimated him, and now the price of that mistake was being paid in blood. "And it gets worse," Valerius said, his voice dropping even lower. "The rogue factions that have been harassing our borders for months, and they weren't acting alone. Kyle was their benefactor, their commander. He's folded them into his army. He now commands a force of fanatics, traitors, and savages." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This had been Cale's plan all along. The rejection, the whispers, the attack, all calculated steps on his path to power. And Lyra. Lyra had just been the spark he needed to light the fire. As if on cue, a royal messenger, his face pale and sweat-sheened, rushed into the room and fell to one knee. He held out a scroll sealed not with wax, but with a crude smear of dried blood. Rowan took it, his fingers feeling clumsy and slow. He broke the seal. Kyle's handwriting was a jagged, arrogant scrawl. It was not a request. It was an ultimatum. "Surrender the Omega. Give me Lyra, and I will allow your people to live. Refuse, and my army will burn a path to your pretty castle and take her from your corpse." Rowan crushed the parchment in his fist. He wanted to rise, to roar, to lead his armies and grind Cale's bones to dust. But when he tried to stand, his legs trembled, and a wave of dizziness forced him back onto the bed. He was a king trapped in a useless body, a wolf in a cage of his own flesh. And outside, a rival was gathering an army to steal his mate and burn his world to the ground.
She spent her days by his side, a silent, helpless witness to his struggle. She changed his bandages, brought him broth he barely touched, and watched the frustration and fury warring in his golden eyes. Every time he gritted his teeth in pain, she felt it like a knife in her own gut. A deep, gnawing guilt had taken root in her soul, a poisonous weed twisting around her heart. This was her fault. all of it. That evening, needing a moment to breathe, she walked the castle corridors. But there was no escape. The air, once filled with the confident buzz of a secure kingdom, was now thick with a palpable tension. Guards spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Servants scurried past, their eyes wide with fear. The entire castle seemed to be holding its breath. As she passed the open door of the war room, she heard voices from within. Valerius and another of Rowan's generals. She froze, hidden in the shadows. "His strength is returning, but too slowly," the general said, his voice heavy with worry. "Kyle's forces have already taken the northern pass. They'll be at the river by week's end." "The king knows this," Valerius's voice rumbled. "He is pushing himself too hard." "He is compromised," the general stated, not with malice, but with the cold, hard pragmatism of a soldier. "His heart has become his greatest weakness. This war, all of this, because of a single she-wolf. A king cannot afford such a vulnerability." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. A single she-wolf, a weakness. Her core misbelief, the one she thought she had started to conquer, the one that told her she was a worthless burden, roared back to life with suffocating force. They were right. Before she arrived, there was peace. Rowan was an untouchable, unshakable force. And now he was wounded. His kingdom was on the brink of a bloody war, and his most trusted men saw her as the cause of it all. She backed away from the door, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle a sob. She stumbled through the halls until she found herself in front of the great map in the main gallery. Kale's forces were marked with cruel blood-red flags, a tide of violence creeping steadily toward them. She stared at the map, but she didn't see armies or territories. She saw a wound on the face of the world that she had caused. Kale's obsession, Rowan's injury, the fear in the eyes of the people in this castle. It all led back to her. She was not a queen. She was a plague. She walked to his chambers, her feet moving as if in a dream. Her decision felt like a shard of ice in her chest, cold and sharp and absolute. This was the only way. She found him standing, leaning heavily on a table, staring out the window at the darkening sky. He was dressed, but he looked pale and drawn, a shadow of the powerful king he was meant to be. He turned as she entered, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. "Lyra." "Don't," she whispered, her voice breaking. She couldn't bear his kindness. Not now. She stopped in the center of the room, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She had to do this. For him. For his kingdom. "I have to leave, Rowan," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "He only wants me, Kyle. The war. It's all because of me. If I go to him, it will stop." His smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. "Lyra, no. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," she cried, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. "I see how they look at me. I hear what they whisper. Your own men think I'm a weakness, and they're right. Look at you. You're wounded. Your kingdom is threatened, and I am the reason." She took a shaky breath, preparing for the final, killing blow. This would hurt more than Kale's rejection, more than any wound, because this time, the words were coming from her. I release you from the bond," she choked out, the lie of physical agony. "I release you from the mark. I am not your queen. I am not your mate." This was it, her lowest point. She was confronting her deepest fear, the belief that she was worthless, by embracing it completely. She was trying to prove her love by arguing her own lack of value, believing that her absence was the greatest gift she could give him. This wasn't running away in fear. This was a noble sacrifice, a self-immolation on the altar of her own guilt. She looked at his strong, beautiful face, memorizing every line, every shadow. "A kingdom needs a strong king," she whispered, her heart shattering into a million pieces. "Not one weakened by a broken Omega." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked toward the door, every step an eternity. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she would break. And she had to do this. She had to save him from herself.
She turned away, and a winter of absolute cold slammed into his soul, a chill that had nothing to do with the poison in his veins. The sight of her walking toward that door, her back straight and her shoulders carrying the weight of a false, noble sacrifice, was a blade twisting in his gut. If she walked through that door, Cale would win. Not with his army, but by proving that Rowan couldn't even protect his own mate's heart. No, he would not allow it. With a surge of will that felt like it was tearing his muscles from his bones, he pushed himself off the table. His legs shook, but they held. He crossed the room in 3 long, unsteady strides, his hand closing on the door and pushing it shut, just as she reached for the handle. The thud of the heavy oak echoed in the sudden, tense silence. She froze, her back to him. "You will not," he said, his voice a raw, ragged command. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, his body screaming in protest. "You will not do this." "I have to," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It's the only way to save you." "Save me?" A harsh, humorless laugh escaped him. He reached out, his hand settling gently on her shoulder. She was trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Lyra, your leaving would be the one thing that would truly break me. Kyle's armies can break my bones. His poison can sap my strength. But you walking away would shatter my soul." She still wouldn't turn. He could feel the war raging inside her. "Before you came," he continued, his voice dropping, becoming softer, more vulnerable than he had ever allowed it to be with anyone. "This castle was a tomb. I was a king of ghosts. I had power. I had a kingdom. And I was utterly, completely alone." He felt the memory of the heartwood pass between them, the shared echo of his desolate solitude. "You did not bring a war to my gates, Lyra. You brought life back into this empty shell of a man. You are not a weakness. My love for you is the only true strength I have left." He gently turned her to face him. Her face was a mess of tears, her eyes wide with a beautiful, heartbreaking confusion. He looked directly into them, willing her to see the truth. "Your heart is not a flaw," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "It is a weapon. It is a strength this kingdom has been missing for 100 years. I am a warrior, Lyra. I can command an army. I can break a siege. But only you can win the people." Her breath hitched. Her tears slowed. He could see the gears turning behind her eyes, his words sinking in, finding the cracks in the armor of her self-loathing. She wasn't a burden. She was a different kind of power, a different kind of queen. The spark of an idea, a flicker of renewed hope ignited in the depths of her gaze. She looked up at him, the last of her despair washed away by a dawning new light. "The people," she whispered, as if tasting the word for the first time.
The next morning, she walked into the war room. The space was filled with grim-faced generals and the tense smell of old maps and fear. They all looked up as she entered, their expressions ranging from surprise to barely concealed disapproval. Rowan was there, seated at the head of the table. He was still pale, but a new light was in his eyes as he watched her. He had saved her from herself. Now it was her turn to save his kingdom. "We cannot win a frontal assault without devastating losses," one of the generals was saying, gesturing to the map. "Cale has the numbers and he has the terrain." "He has the numbers," Lyra said, her voice quiet but clear. Every head in the room snapped toward her. "But he does not have their hearts." She walked to the table, her hands flat on the cool, worn wood. She looked not at Rowan, but at his men. "I know the Silver Moon warriors," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "They are not murderers or savages, they are proud. They followed Cale because he sold them a story of a stolen mate and a tyrant king. They are fighting for a lie." Valerius grunted. "A lie they seem quite willing to die for, my lady." Then we must give them a truth worth living for, she countered, her gaze unwavering. Your plan is to meet his army with yours, steel against steel, a bloodbath. But I have another plan. The silence in the room was absolute. She took a deep breath. Arrange a parley, on neutral ground, but not between two alphas. It will be between me and my old pack. A murmur of disbelief went through the generals. That's suicide, one of them exclaimed. He'll kill you on sight. He won't, Lyra said with chilling certainty. Because his entire claim is built on the idea that he is fighting for me. To kill me in front of both armies would be to admit he is a liar, and he is too arrogant for that. She looked at Rowan. I will not speak of treaties or surrender. I will speak to them of home. I will remind them that Kale has allied himself with the same lawless rogues who have been bleeding their borders for months. I will use their pride not as a weapon against us, but as a weapon against him. She could see the doubt on their faces. It was a crazy, desperate gamble, an Omega's gambit. But then Rowan spoke, his voice leaving no room for argument. You will have your parley, he said, his golden eyes locking with hers. He stood, his presence commanding the room despite his injury. I will bring my army to the field. We will be the sword at your back. But you, my queen, you will be the voice at the front. His faith in her was a warm, steadying presence, chasing away the last of her fear. She was no longer a victim of this war. She was an architect of its end.
The morning of the parley dawned cold and gray, the sky the color of old steel. Rowan rode at the head of his army, the finest fighting force in the known world, a river of silent, disciplined power flowing behind him. But for the first time in his life, he was not leading it alone. At his side, mounted on a spirited white mare, rode Lyra. She was not the trembling Omega he had found in the woods. She was not the frightened girl who had flinched from his touch. Today, she was every inch the queen. She wore simple, dark riding leathers, practical and elegant, her dark hair braided back from a face that was pale but utterly resolute. Her back was straight, her chin was high, and her eyes were fixed on the horizon. He watched her, a feeling of profound, heart-stopping pride swelling in his chest. He was still weak, the poison a dull, constant ache in his arm, a reminder of how close he had come to losing her. But riding beside her now, he had never felt stronger. His army was the physical manifestation of his power, 1,000 sharp claws and teeth ready to rend and tear. But all of that power was now in service of her plan, in service of her wisdom. His sword in service of her soul. The tension in the air was so thick he could taste it, the metallic tang of unsheathed steel and unspoken fear. Every one of his soldiers thought this was a fool's errand, a lamb walking into a slaughter. But they followed because he, their king, had ordered it. And he had ordered it because he had absolute faith in the woman beside him. They crested the final hill, and the valley of the parley opened up before them. On the far side, a dark mass of warriors waited, a chaotic, undisciplined army, a mix of the proud Silver Moon banner and the tattered, blood-soaked flags of the rogue clans. And at their head, a single figure sat mounted on a black warhorse. Kyle. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of their enemies, Lyra turned to him. There was no fear in her eyes, only a calm, steady resolve that took his breath away. She was ready.
The wind howled a lonely song across the valley, whipping strands of hair across her face. It was cold. So cold. Across the dead grass, Kale sat on his warhorse, a black iron statue of arrogance. He was sneering. She had expected that. He didn't address her. Instead, he raised his voice, pitching it to carry across the field to Rowan. King Rowan, have you come to your senses? Surrender the Omega, and I will let you crawl back to your castle with your life. Lyra didn't wait for Rowan to answer. With a single glance at him, a silent promise, she slid from her mare. Her boots sank into the soft earth, and she began to walk, alone, Every eye in both armies was on her. A single, small figure walking into the no-man's land between two waiting forces. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. But her steps were steady. She wasn't running anymore. She stopped in the middle of the field and turned, not to Kale, but to the army of the Silver Moon Pack. To the warriors she had grown up with. She saw their faces, confused, angry, uncertain. "I am Lyra," she said, her voice not the whisper of an omega, but the clear, ringing tone of a queen. It carried on the wind, reaching every one of them. "I see you. I see the sons of Torvin and the brother of Alara. I remember hunting in these woods with your fathers. I remember mending your training tunics." A flicker of recognition, a shifting of feet. She had their attention. "You were told this war is for my honor," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You were told I was stolen. That is a lie." Her gaze swept over them, meeting as many eyes as she could. "But there is a deeper lie you have been sold. Look to your left and to your right. Who stands beside you in your ranks?" She paused, letting them look. Letting them see the ragged, wild-eyed rogues interspersed among their own proud warriors. "You see the very wolves who raided our borders, the ones who murdered our patrols and stole our food, the ones who cornered me in the woods that night." Her voice rose, filled with a righteous anger they could understand. "Kale did not save me from them. He has invited them into our home. He made a deal with our enemies to seize power. He is not your savior. He is your betrayer." The truth unraveled in the cold morning air. Doubt, like a fast-moving plague, spread through the Silver Moon ranks. She saw it in the way they looked at each other, then at the rogues beside them, and finally, at Kale. His face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. He had lost them. She had taken them from him with nothing but the truth. "You lie!" he roared, his voice cracking with fury. He spurred his horse, not at Rowan, but at her. A blur of black rage, his sword drawn and glinting in the flat gray light. He lunged. Time shattered. A black and silver streak of pure power intercepted him. Rowan. He met Kale's charge, his own blade a blur, the clang of steel on steel a deafening scream. But it was Lyra who ended it. "No more," she commanded, her voice cutting through the sounds of battle. The authority in that single phrase was absolute. Both Rowan and Kale froze. "This does not end with more blood." She walked toward Kale, who was panting, his eyes wild with hate. She stopped just out of his sword's reach and looked at the man who had shattered her world. And she felt nothing. No fear. No hatred. Only a quiet, final pity. "You wanted to be powerful," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You wanted a throne. You wanted to be respected." She shook her head softly. "But you built your entire life on a lie. You were right about one thing, Kale. The fates do not pair a lion with a mouse." She met his gaze, and he saw the queen in her eyes. "They pair them with a lioness." With a single glance at Valerius, she gave the order. "Take him." Before Kale could react, Rowan's guards surrounded him, pulling him from his horse. She turned her back on him. "Banish him. Let him wander the wild lands as the rogues do." She looked at him one last time, over her shoulder. "Now you will have nothing."
Rowan watched, his heart a thunderous drum in his chest, his entire being filled with a feeling so profound, so overwhelming, it was more than just pride. It was awe. She had faced down an army. She had disarmed them with her courage and her heart. She had defeated her tormentor not by lowering herself to his level of violence, but by rising above it with a queen's grace and a queen's judgment. As Kale was dragged away, screaming curses that were already beginning to sound pathetic and hollow, a stillness fell over the valley. The Silver Moon warriors stood in stunned silence, their weapons hanging loosely at their sides. They looked lost. Their alpha was a traitor, their cause a lie. Then, one warrior, a broad-shouldered man Rowan recognized as the head of their patrols, dropped his sword. It landed in the grass, with a soft thud. He walked forward, his eyes fixed on Lyra. He stopped a few feet from her and slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee. He bowed his head. "My queen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As if a dam had broken, what followed was a wave of motion. Another warrior knelt, then 3 more, then a dozen. Within the span of a breath, the entire Silver Moon army was on its knees in the muddy field. They were not bowing to him, the conquering king. They were bending the knee to her, their Luna Queen, the Omega who had just saved them from their own folly. He walked to her side, his own soul aching with a love so fierce it was a physical presence. He was the most powerful alpha in the world, and yet, in that moment, he knew the greatest strength in the valley resided in the small, determined woman standing beside him. The war was over, and she had won it. He reached down and took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. Her hand was steady in his. It was no longer the hand of a victim. It was the hand of a partner, a ruler. He looked out at the kneeling army and then down at her. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would heal the wounds this conflict had carved into the heart of his kingdom.
Weeks later, the Great Hall was no longer a place of fear. Tonight, it was a sanctuary of celebration, filled to the rafters with the lords and ladies of the entire kingdom. The air was warm, smelling of wine and roasted herbs, and the contented hum of a kingdom at peace. Lyra stood beside Rowan, not behind him, before the great throne. She wore a gown of starlight silver, the color of the royal house, but it was not the dress that gave her strength. It was the quiet confidence that had settled deep in her bones. She met the gazes of the court, and this time she saw not judgment, but genuine respect. Awe. Her eyes drifted to the high arches near the back of the hall. For a fleeting moment, she saw a shadow detach itself from the others. A lone, gaunt figure, Kyle. He had been allowed to watch this single moment, the final term of his banishment, before disappearing into the wild lands forever. He was a ghost at the feast, a reminder of a past that no longer had any power over her. As quickly as he appeared, he was gone. Rowan turned to her, and the entire hall seemed to fade away. There was no one else in the world but him. His golden eyes were not the eyes of a king claiming a prize. They were the eyes of a man looking at his entire world. The first mark was for destiny, he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. This one. This is for me. This is for you. This is for us. He lowered his head, and his lips brushed against the skin of her throat, right over the faint, silvery trace of the first mark. This time there was no surge of shocking magic, no violent claiming. There was only an incredible soul-deep warmth that spread through her, a gentle and deliberate vow. As he marked her, the crest bloomed to life, not with the fierce, possessive light of their first bonding, but with a soft, steady, and eternal glow. It was not a brand of ownership. It was a promise. Her world tilted, not with shock, but with a profound sense of rightness. The broken pieces of her soul had not just been mended. They had been reforged into something stronger, something more beautiful. He raised his head, and his hand found hers. Together, they turned to face their people, a king and his queen. The mark on her throat glowed softly, a beacon of light and love in the heart of the kingdom. She was no longer the rejected Omega or the stolen bride. She was home.